Don Quixote of the Mancha, retold by Judge Parry. Preface. A version of Don Quixote, which is appended to Mr. Walter Crane's illustrations, needs perhaps no apology, but I desire to state briefly what I have endeavored to do. No existing abridgment of Don Quixote known to me gives in simple narrative form the adventures of knight and squire, with as much of the wisdom and humour of their discourse as would be within the grasp of the younger generation of readers. This I have tried to produce. In doing it, I have made use of all the English translations, but the basis of this book is Thomas Shelton's translation, the language of which seems to me better to express the humour of Cervantes than any other. Many will consider such a task in the nature of sacrilege, or at the best, verging on the impertinent. With these views I have much sympathy myself. But at least let it be understood that all I have attempted to do is to tell a well-known story in print, as one who loves it would seek to tell it in words, to those around his own fireside, in the hope that some may gather from this story that there is a vast storehouse of humor and wisdom awaiting them in the book itself. Chapter 1. An introduction to that famous gentleman, Don Quixote of the Mancha. This is the story that Miguel de Cervantes, Spaniard, published in 1605, which the world has been reading again and again ever since. Once upon a time there lived in a certain village, in a province of Spain called the Mancha, a gentleman named Quixada, or Quesada, for indeed historians differ about this, whose house was full of old lances, halberds, and such other armors and weapons. He was, besides, the owner of an ancient target or shield, a raw-boned steed, and a swift greyhound. His pot consisted daily of common meats, some lentils on Fridays, and perhaps a roast pigeon for Sunday's dinner. His dress was a black suit with velvet breeches, and slippers of the same color, which he kept for holidays, and a suit of homespun, which he wore on weekdays. On the purchase of these few things, he spent the small rents that came to him every year. He had in his house a woman servant of about some 40 years old, a niece, not yet 20, and a lad that served him both in field and at home, and could saddle his horse or manage a pruning hook. The master himself was about 50 years old, a strong, hard-featured man with a withered face. He was an early riser, and had once been very fond of hunting. But now, for a great portion of the year, he applied himself wholly to reading the old books of knighthood, and this with such keen delight that he forgot all about the pleasures of the chase and neglected all household matters. His mania and folly grew to such a pitch that he sold many acres of his lands to buy books of the exploits and adventures of the knights of old. These he took for true and correct histories, and when his friends, the curate of the village, or Mr. Nicholas, the worthy barber of the town, came to see him, he would dispute with them as to which of the knights of romance had done the greatest deeds. So eagerly did he plunge into the reading of these books that he many times spent whole days and nights poring over them, and in the end, through little sleep and much reading, his brain became tired, and he fairly lost his wits. His fancy was filled with those things he read, of enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, tempests, and other impossible follies, and those romantic tales so firmly took hold of him that he believed no history to be so certain and sincere as they were. Finally, his wit being extinguished, he was seized with one of the strangest whims that ever madman stumbled on in this world, for it seemed to him right and necessary that he himself should become a knight-errant, and ride through the world in arms to seek adventures and practice in person all that he had read about the knights of old. Therefore he resolved that he would make a name for himself by revenging the injuries of others, and counting all manner of dangers and difficulties, until in the end he should be rewarded for his valor in arms by the crown of some mighty empire. And first of all he caused certain old rusty arms that belonged to his great-grandfather, and had lain for many years neglected and forgotten in a by-corner of his house, to be brought out and well scoured. He trimmed them and dressed them as well as he could, and then he saw that they had something wanting, for instead of a proper helmet, they had only a morion or headpiece, like a steel bonnet without any visor. This his industry supplied, for he made a visor for his helmet by patching and pasting certain papers together, and this pasteboard, fitted to the morion, gave it all the appearance of a real helmet. Then, to make sure that it was strong enough, he out with his sword and gave it a blow or two, and with the very first did quite undo that which had cost him a week to make. He did not at all approve the ease with which it was destroyed, and to make things better he placed certain iron bars within it, in such a manner that made him feel sure it was now sound and strong, without putting it to a second trial. He next visited his horse, who, though he had more corners than a Spanish real, or shilling, which in those days was anything but round, and had nothing on him but skin and bone, yet he seemed to him a better steed than Bucephalus, the noble animal that carried Alexander the Great when he went to battle. He spent 4 days inventing a name for his horse, saying to himself that it was not fit that so famous a knight's horse, and so good a beast, should want a known name. Therefore he tried to find a name that should both give people some notion of what he had been before he was the steed of a knight-errant, and also what he now was. For, seeing that his lord and master was going to change his calling, it was only right that his horse should have a new name, famous and high-sounding, and worthy of his new position in life. And after having chosen, made up, put aside, and thrown over any number of names, as not coming up to his idea, he finally hit upon Rocinante, a name in his opinion sublime and well-sounding, expressing in a word what he had been when he was a simple carriage horse, and what was expected of him in his new dignity. The name being thus given to his horse, he made up his mind to give himself a name also, and in that thought labored another 8 days. Finally, he determined to call himself Don Quixote, which has made people think that his name was Quijada and not Queseda, as others have said, and remembering that the great knights of olden time were not satisfied with a mere dry name, but added to it the name of their kingdom or country, so he, like a good knight, added to his own that also of his province, and called himself Don Quixote of the Mancha, whereby he declared his birthplace and did honor to his country by taking it for his surname. His armor being scoured, his morion transformed into a helmet, his horse named, and himself furnished with a new name, he considered that now he wanted nothing but a lady on whom he might bestow his service and affection. For, he said to himself, remembering what he had read in the books of knightly adventures, if I should, by good hap, encounter with some giant, as knights errant ordinarily do, and if I should overthrow him with one blow to the ground, or cut him with a stroke in 2 halves, or finally overcome and make him yield to me, it would be only right and proper that I should have some lady to whom I might present him. Then would he, entering my sweet lady's presence, say unto her with a humble and submissive voice, Madam, I am the giant Caraculiambro, lord of the island called Melendrania, whom the never too much praised knight Don Quixote of the Mancha hath overcome in single combat. He hath commanded me to present myself to your greatness, that it may please your highness to dispose of me according to your liking. You may believe that the heart of the knight danced for joy when he made that grand speech, and he was even more pleased when he had found out one whom he might call his lady. For, they say, there lived in the next village to his own a hale, buxom country wench, with whom he was sometime in love, though for the matter of that, she had never known of it or taken any notice of him whatever. She was called Aldanca Lorenzo, and her he thought fittest to honor as the lady of his fancy. Then he began to search about in his mind for a name that should not vary too much from her own, but should at the same time show people that she was a princess or lady of quality. Thus it was that he called her Dulcinea of Toboso, a name sufficiently strange, romantic, and musical for the lady of so brave a knight. And now, having taken to himself both armor, horse, and lady fair, he was ready to go forth and seek adventures. Chapter 2 of the first sally that Don Quixote made to seek adventures. All his preparations being made, he could no longer resist the desire of carrying out his plans, his head being full of the wrongs he intended to put right, the errors he wished to amend, and the evil deeds he felt himself called upon to punish. And therefore, without telling any living creature, and unseen of anybody, somewhat before daybreak, it being one of the warmest days in July, he armed himself from head to foot, mounted on Rocinante, laced on his strange helmet, gathered up his target, seized his lance, and through the back door of his yard sallied forth into the fields, marvelously cheerful and content to see how easily he had started on his new career. But scarcely was he clear of the village when he was struck by a terrible thought, and one which did well nigh overthrow all his plans. For he recollected that he had never been knighted, and therefore, according to the laws of knighthood, neither could he, nor ought he, to combat with any knight. And even if he were a knight, he remembered to have read that as a new knight he ought to wear white armor without any device upon his shield, until he should win it by force of arms. These thoughts made him waver a little in his plan, but more for the reason that his head was full of his folly than for any other. He determined to cause himself to be knighted by the first he met, as others had done of whom he had read in the books which had so turned his brain. As to the white armor, he resolved at the first opportunity to scour his own until it should be whiter than ermine, and having satisfied himself with these intentions, he pursued his way without following any other road than that which his horse was pleased to choose, believing that to be the most correct way of meeting with knightly adventures. And as he rode along, he exclaimed to the empty air, as if he had been actually in love, "O Princess Dulcinea, lady of this captive heart, much wrong hast thou done me by dismissing me, and reproaching me with thy cruel commandment not to appear before thy beauty. I pray thee, sweet lady, to remember this thy faithful slave, who for thy love suffers so many tortures." 1,000 other ravings, after the style and manner that his books had taught him, did he add to this, as he travelled along, meeting with no adventure worthy to be set down, whilst the sun mounted so swiftly, and with so great heat that it would have been sufficient to have melted his brains, if he had any left. He journeyed all that day long, and at night both he and his horse were tired and marvellously pressed by hunger, and looking about him on every side to see whether he could discover any castle to which he might retire for the night, he saw an inn near unto the highway on which he travelled, which was as welcome a sight to him as if he had seen a guiding star. Then, spurring his horse, he rode towards it as fast as he might, and arrived there much about nightfall. There stood by chance at the inn door 2 jolly peasant women who were travelling towards Seville with some carriers who happened to take up their lodging in that inn that same evening. And as our knight-errant believed all that he saw or heard to take place in the same manner as he had read in his books, he no sooner saw the inn than he fancied it to be a castle with 4 turrets and pinnacles of shining silver, with a drawbridge, a deep moat, and all such things as belong to grand castles. Drawing slowly towards it, he checked Rocinante with the bridle when he was close to the inn, and rested a while to see if any dwarf would mount on the battlements to give warning with the sound of a trumpet how some knight did approach the castle. But, seeing they stayed so long, and Rocinante was eager to get up to his stable, he went to the inn door, and there beheld the 2 wenches that stood at it, whom he supposed to be 2 beautiful damsels, or lovely ladies, that did solace themselves before the castle gates. At that moment it happened that a certain swineherd, as he gathered together his hogs, blew the horn which was wont to bring them together, and at once Don Quixote imagined it was some dwarf who gave notice of his arrival, and he rode up to the inn door with marvellous delight. The ladies, when they beheld one armed in that manner with lance and target, made haste to run into the inn. But Don Quixote, seeing their fear by their flight, lifted up his pasteboard visor, showed his withered and dusky face, and spoke to them thus: "Let not your ladyships fly, nor fear any harm, for it does not belong to the order of knighthood, which I profess, to wrong anybody, much less such high-born damsels, as your appearance shows you to be." The wenches looked at him very earnestly, and sought with their eyes for his face, which the ill-fashioned helmet concealed. But when they heard themselves called high-born damsels, they could not contain their laughter, which was so loud that Don Quixote was quite ashamed of them and rebuked them, saying, "Modesty is a comely ornament of the beautiful, and too much laughter springing from trifles is great folly. But I do not tell you this to make you the more ashamed, for my desire is none other than to do you all the honour and service I may." This speech merely increased their laughter, and with it his anger, which would have passed all bounds if the innkeeper had not come out at this instant. Now this innkeeper was a man of exceeding fatness, and therefore, as some think, of a very peaceable disposition. And when he saw that strange figure, armed in such fantastic armour, he was very nearly keeping the two women company in their merriment and laughter. But, being afraid of the owner of such a lance and target, he resolved to behave civilly, for fear of what might happen, and thus addressed him, "Sir Knight, if your worship do seek for lodging, we have no bed at liberty, but you shall find all other things in abundance." To which Don Quixote, noting the humility of the constable of the castle, for such he took him to be, replied, "Anything, Sir Constable, may serve me, for my arms are my dress, and the battlefield is my bed." While he was speaking, the innkeeper laid hand on Don Quixote's stirrup and helped him to alight. This he did with great difficulty and pain, for he had not eaten a crumb all that day. He then bade the innkeeper have special care of his horse, saying he was one of the best animals that ever ate bread. The innkeeper looked at Rocinante again and again, but he did not seem to him half so good as Don Quixote valued him. However, he led him civilly to the stable, and returned to find his guest in the hands of the high-born damsels, who were helping him off with his armour. They had taken off his back and breastplates, but they could in no way get his head and neck out of the strange, ill-fashioned helmet which he had fastened on with green ribbons. Now these knots were so impossible to untie that the wenches would have cut them, but this Don Quixote would not agree to. Therefore he remained all the night with his helmet on, and looked the drollest and strangest figure you could imagine. And he was now so pleased with the women, whom he still took to be ladies and dames of the castle, that he said to them, "Never was knight so well attended on and served by ladies as was Don Quixote. When he departed from his village, damsels attended on him, and princesses on his horse. O ladies, Rocinante is the name of my steed, and I am called Don Quixote. And the time shall come when your ladyships may command me, and I obey. And then the valour of mine arm shall discover the desire I have to do you service." The women could make nothing of his talk, but asked him if he would eat. And Don Quixote, replying that such was his desire, there was straightway laid a table at the inn door. The host brought out a portion of badly boiled haddocks, and a black greasy loaf, which was all the inn could supply. But the manner of Don Quixote's eating was the best sport in the world, for with his helmet on he could put nothing into his mouth himself, if others did not help him to find his way, and therefore one of the wenches served his turn at that, and helped to feed him. But they could not give him drink after that manner, and he would have remained dry forever if the innkeeper had not bored a cane, and putting one end in his mouth, poured the wine down the other, and all this he suffered rather than cut the ribbons of his helmet. And as he sat at supper, the swineherd again sounded his horn, and Don Quixote was still firm in the belief that he was in some famous castle where he was served with music, and that the stale haddock was fresh trout, the bread of the finest flour, the two wenches high-born damsels, and the innkeeper, the constable of the castle. Thus he thought his career of knight-errant was well begun, but he was still greatly troubled by the thought that he was not yet dubbed knight, and could not therefore rightly follow his adventures until he received the honour of knighthood. Chapter 3. Of the pleasant manner of the knighting of Don Quixote. When he had finished his sorry supper, he took his host with him to the stable, and shutting the door, threw himself down upon his knees before him, saying, "I will never rise from this place where I am, Sir Constable, until your courtesy shall grant unto me a boon that I mean to demand of you, something which will add to your renown and to the profit of all the human race." The innkeeper, seeing his guest at his feet, and hearing him speak these words, stood confounded at the sight, not knowing what he would say or do next, and tried to make him arise. But all was in vain, until he had promised him that he would grant him any gift that he sought at his hands. "Señor," said Don Quixote, rising from his knees, "I did never expect less from your great magnificence, and now I will tell you that the boon which I demand of you, and which you have so generously granted, is that tomorrow in the morning you will dub me knight. This night I will watch mine armour in the chapel of your castle, and in the morning, as I have said, the rest of my desires shall be fulfilled, that I may set out in a proper manner throughout the 4 parts of the world to seek adventures to the benefit of the poor and needy, as the duty of knighthood and of knights errant." The innkeeper, who was a bit of a jester, and had before thought that the wits of his guest were none of the best, was sure that his suspicions were true when he heard him speak in this manner, and in order to enjoy a joke at his expense, he resolved to fall in with his humour, and told him that there was great reason in what he desired, which was only natural and proper in a knight of such worth as he seemed to be. He added further that there was no chapel in his castle where he might watch his arms, for he had it broken down to build it up anew, but nevertheless he knew well that in a case of necessity they might be watched in any other place, and therefore he might watch them that night in the lower court of the castle, where in the morning he, the innkeeper, would perform all the proper ceremonies, so that he should be made not only a dubbed knight, but such a one as should not have a fellow in the whole universe. The innkeeper now gave orders that Don Quixote should watch his armour in a great yard that lay near unto one side of the inn, wherefore he gathered together all his arms, laid them on a cistern near to a well, and buckling on his target, he laid hold of his lance, and walked up and down before the cistern very demurely, until night came down upon the scene. In the meantime, the roguish innkeeper told all the rest that lodged in the inn of the folly of his guest, the watching of his arms, and the knighthood which he expected to receive. They all wondered very much at so strange a kind of folly, and going out to behold him from a distance, they saw that sometimes he marched to and fro with a quiet gesture, other times, leaning upon his lance, he looked upon his armour for a good space of time without beholding any other thing save his arms. Although it was now night, yet was the moon so clear that everything which the knight did was easily seen by all beholders. And now one of the carriers that lodged in the inn resolved to give his mules some water, and for that purpose it was necessary to move Don Quixote's armour that lay on the cistern. Seeing the carrier approach, Don Quixote called to him in a loud voice, "O thou, whosoever thou art, bold knight, who dares to touch the armour of the bravest adventurer that ever girded sword? Look well what thou doest, and touch them not, if thou meanest not to leave thy life in payment for thy meddling." The carrier took no notice of these words, though it were better for him if he had, but laying hold of the armour, threw it piece by piece into the middle of the yard. When Don Quixote saw this, he lifted up his eyes towards heaven, and addressing his thoughts, as it seemed, to his lady Dulcinea, he said, "Assist me, dear lady, in this insult offered to thy vassal, and let not thy favour and protection fail me in this my first adventure." Uttering these and other such words, he let slip his target or shield, and lifting up his lance with both hands, he gave the carrier so round a knock on his pate that it overthrew him on to the ground, and if he had caught him a second, he would not have needed any surgeon to cure him. This done, he gathered up his armour again, and laying the pieces where they had been before, he began walking up and down near them with as much quietness as he did at first. But very soon afterwards, another carrier, without knowing what had happened, for his companion yet lay on the ground, came also to give his mules water, and coming to take away the armour to get at the cistern. Don Quixote let slip again his target, and lifting his lance, brought it down on the carrier's head, which he broke in several places. All the people in the inn, and amongst them the innkeeper, came running out when they heard the noise, and Don Quixote, seeing them, seized his target, and drawing his sword, cried aloud, "O lady of all beauty, now, if ever, is the time for thee to turn the eyes of thy greatness on thy captive knight, who is on the eve of so marvellous great an adventure." Saying this seemed to fill him with so great a courage that if he had been assaulted by all the carriers in the universe, he would not have retreated one step. The companions of the wounded men, seeing their fellows in so evil a plight, began to rain stones on Don Quixote from a distance, who defended himself as well as he might with his target, and durst not leave the cistern, lest he should appear to abandon his arms. The innkeeper cried to them to let him alone, for he had already told them that he was mad. But all the time Don Quixote cried out louder than the innkeeper, calling them all disloyal men and traitors, and that the lord of the castle was a treacherous and bad knight to allow them to use a knight-errant so basely. And if he had only received the order of knighthood, he would have punished them soundly for his treason. Then calling to the carriers, he said, "As for you base and rascally ruffians, you are beneath my notice. Throw at me, approach, draw near, and do me all the hurt you may, for you shall ere long receive the reward of your insolence." These words, which he spoke with great spirit and boldness, struck a terrible fear into all those who assaulted him, and, partly moved by his threats and partly persuaded by the innkeeper, they left off throwing stones at him, and he allowed them to carry away the wounded men, while he returned to his watch with great quietness and gravity. The innkeeper did not very much like Don Quixote's pranks, and therefore determined to shorten the ceremony and give him the order of knighthood at once before anyone else was injured. Approaching him, therefore, he made apologies for the insolence of the base fellows who had thrown stones at him, and explained that it was not with his consent, and that he thought them well punished for their impudence. He added that it was not necessary for Don Quixote to watch his armor any more, because the chief point of being knighted was to receive the stroke of the sword on the neck and shoulders, and that ceremony he was ready to perform at once. All this Don Quixote readily believed, and answered that he was most eager to obey him, and requested him to finish everything as speedily as possible, for he said as soon as he was knighted, if he was assaulted again, he intended not to leave one person alive in all the castle, except those which the constable should command, whom he would spare for his sake. The innkeeper, alarmed at what he said, and fearing lest he should carry out his threat, set about the ceremony without delay. He brought out his day-book, in which he wrote down the accounts of the hay and straw which he sold to carriers who came to the inn, and attended by a small boy holding the end of a candle and walking before him, and followed by the two women who were staying at the inn, he approached Don Quixote. He solemnly commanded him to kneel upon his knees, while he mumbled something which he pretended to read out of the book that he held in his hand. Then he gave him a good blow on the neck, and after that another sound thwack over the shoulders with his own sword, always as he did so continuing to mumble and murmur as though he were reading something out of his book. This being done, he commanded one of the damsels to gird on his sword, which she did with much grace and cleverness, and it was with difficulty that they all kept from laughing during this absurd ceremony. But what they had already seen of Don Quixote's fury made them careful not to annoy him, even by a smile. When she had girded on his sword, the damsel said, "May you be a fortunate knight, and meet with good success in all your adventures." Don Quixote asked her how she was called, that he might know to whom he was obliged for the favors he had received. She answered with great humility that she was named Tolosa, and was a butcher's daughter of Toledo. Don Quixote replied, requesting her to call herself from henceforth the Lady Tolosa, which she promised to perform. The other damsel buckled on his spurs, and when Don Quixote asked her name, she told him it was Molinera, and that she was the daughter of an honest miller of Antequera. Don Quixote entreated her also to call herself Lady Molinera, and offered her new services and favors. These strange and never-before-seen ceremonies being ended, Don Quixote could not rest until he was mounted on horseback, that he might go to seek adventures. He therefore caused Rocinante to be instantly saddled, leaped on his back, and, embracing the innkeeper, thanked him in 1,000 wild and ridiculous ways for the great favor he had done him in dubbing him knight. The innkeeper, who was only eager to be rid of him without delay, answered him in the same fashion, and let him march off without demanding from him a single farthing for his food or lodging. Chapter 4. Of what befell our knight when he left the inn. It was dawn when Don Quixote went out from the inn, so full of pleasure to behold himself knighted that his very horse girths were ready to burst for joy. But calling to memory some advice that the innkeeper had given him about the necessity of carrying with him money and clean shirts when he went on his adventures, he determined to return to his house and obtain these things, and also find for himself a squire. For this office he fixed in his own mind upon a ploughman, a neighbor of his, a poor man who had many children, but yet a man who was very fit, as he thought, to be his squire. With this view, he turned Rocinante towards his own village, who, knowing that he was on his way home, began to trot along with so good a will that he seemed not to touch the ground. He had not travelled far when he heard from a thicket hard by the shrill cries of some weak and delicate mortal in grievous distress. No sooner did he hear them than he exclaimed, "I am indeed thankful for the favour done to me by giving me so soon an opportunity of performing what is due to my profession, and gathering the fruits of my desires. These cries doubtless come from some distressed man or woman who has need of my protection and aid." Then, turning the reins, he guided Rocinante towards the place whence the voice seemed to proceed, and within a few paces after he had entered into the thicket, he saw a mare tied up to one oak, and to another was tied a youth, all naked from the middle upward, of about 15 years of age. Now it was he that cried so pitifully, and not without cause, for a sturdy fellow of a farmer was beating him soundly with a girdle, accompanying each stroke with a reproof and piece of advice, saying, "The tongue must peace, and the eyes be wary." And the boy, whose name was Andrew, answered, "I will never do it again, good master. I will never do it again. I promise to have more care of your things from henceforth." Seeing what passed, Don Quixote cried out with an angry voice, "Ill it becomes you, discourteous knight, to deal thus with one that cannot defend himself. Mount, therefore, on horseback, and take thy lance." For the farmer had a lance leaning against the very same tree to which his mare was tied. "For I will make thee know that it is the act of a coward to do that which thou dost." The farmer, beholding this strange figure, buckled in armor and brandishing a lance over his head, gave himself up for a dead man, and answered him with mild and submissive words, saying, "Sir knight, the youth who I am beating is mine own servant, and keepeth for me a flock of sheep. But he is grown so negligent that he loseth one of them every other day, and because I correct him for his carelessness and knavery, he says I do it through covetousness and miserliness, so as not to pay him his due wages. But on my conscience I assure you, he lies." "What? The lie in my presence, rascally clown?" cried Don Quixote. "By the sun that shines above us, I will run thee through and through with my lance, base carle. Pay him instantly, without another word, or I will finish and destroy thee in a moment. Loose him forthwith." The farmer, hanging down his head, made no reply, but released poor Andrew, of whom Don Quixote demanded how much his master owed him. The boy answered that it was 9 months' wages and 7 reals a month. Casting it up, Don Quixote found that it amounted to 63 reals, and commanded the farmer to pay the money at once, unless he had a mind to die for it. This the farmer, who was in a terrible fright, promised to do, but he said, "The worst of it is, Sir Knight, that I have no money here. Let Andrew come with me to my house, and I will pay him his wages to the last real." "I go with him," said the boy. "Evil befall me if I do." "No, sir, I don't intend to do that, for as soon as ever we were alone, he would flay me alive." "He will not dare to do it," said Don Quixote, "for my command is sufficient to make him respect me, and on condition that he will swear to me to carry out his promise by the order of knighthood which he hath received, I will set him free and assure thee of the payment." "Good, your worship," said the youth. "Mark well what you say, for this man, my master, is no knight, nor did he ever receive any order of knighthood. He is John Haldudo, the rich, and lives at Quintanar." "That is no matter," said Don Quixote, "for there may be knights of the Haldudos." "The good knight speaks well, friend Andrew," said his master. "Do me but the pleasure to come with me, and I swear by all the orders of knighthood that are in the world to pay thee, as I have said, to the last real." "With this," said Don Quixote, "I will rest satisfied, and see that thou fulfillest it as thou hast sworn. If not, I swear again to thee by the same oath to return and seek thee out once more, and chastise thee. And I will find thee out, though thou didst hide thyself closer than a lizard. And if thou desirest to know who it is that commands thee thus, know that I am the valiant Don Quixote of the Mancha, the righter of wrongs and the scourge of injustice." Saying this, the knight clapped spurs to his Rocinante and was quickly gone from him. The farmer followed him with his eyes, and seeing that he was beyond the wood and quite out of sight, he returned to Andrew and said, "Come to me, child, for I will pay thee what I owe thee, as that righter of wrongs hath commanded." "Upon my word," said Andrew, "you do well to fulfill the good knight's commandments, and I pray that he may live 1,000 years, for he is so brave and so just a judge that if you pay me not, he will come back and do all he promised." "I also do believe the same," said the farmer, "but for the much love I bear thee, I will increase the debt that I may add to the payment." And seizing him by the arm, he tied him again to the oak, where he gave him so many blows as to leave him for dead. "Call now, Master Andrew," he said, "for thy righter of wrongs, and thou shalt see that he cannot undo this, though I think I have not finished the doing of it, for I have yet a desire to flay thee alive, as thou didst fear." But he untied him at last, and gave him leave to go and seek out his judge, to the end that he might execute the sentence he had pronounced. Andrew departed somewhat discontented, swearing to search for the valiant Don Quixote of the Mancha, and relate to him point for point all that had passed, and the farmer might be repaid sevenfold. Nevertheless he wept as he went along, and his master remained behind laughing, and thus did the valiant Don Quixote right this wrong. As for the knight, it appeared to him that he had made a very happy and noble beginning to his feats of arms, and as he rode towards his village, he recited to himself in a low voice these words: "Well mayest thou call thyself happy above all other women of the earth. O, above all beauties, beautiful Dulcinea of Toboso, since it has fallen to thy lot to hold submissive to thy will a knight so renowned and valorous as is and ever shall be Don Quixote of the Mancha, who, as all the world knows, but yesterday received the order of knighthood, and today hath destroyed the greatest outrage and wrong that injustice and cruelty could commit. Today hath he wrested the scourge from the hand of the pitiless foe, who so cruelly beat the delicate infant." Soon afterwards he came to a spot where the road branched into four, and there came into his fancy the crossways he had read of, where the knights-errant used to ponder which of the roads they should take, and that he might imitate them, he let slip the reins on Rocinante's neck, submitting his will to that of his steed, who followed his first intention, which was to return home to his own stable. And having travelled some 2 miles, Don Quixote discovered a great troop of people, who, as it was afterwards known, were certain merchants of Toledo, that rode towards Murcia to buy silks. They were 6 in number, and came with their parasols or sun umbrellas, and 4 serving men a horseback, and 3 lackeys. Scarce had Don Quixote perceived them, when he straight imagined them to be a new adventure, and so that he might imitate as far as possible the passages which he had read in his books, he settled himself with a gallant air and resolute bearing firmly in his stirrups, grasped his lance, brought his target over his breast, and stood, waiting, posted in the middle of the road, for those whom he took to be knights errant like himself. And when they were so near that they might hear and see him, he lifted up his voice and said, "Let all the world stand and pass no further, if all the world will not confess that there is not in all the world a more beautiful damsel than the Empress of the Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea of Toboso." The merchants stopped at the sound of these words to behold the marvellous and ridiculous shape of him that spake them, and at once suspected the madness of the speaker. Curious to know the meaning of the confession he demanded from them, one of the merchants, who was a bit of a wag and very sharp-witted, said to Don Quixote, "Sir Knight, we know not who that good lady may be you speak of. Show her therefore to us, and if she be as beautiful as you report, we will with right good will, and without further trouble, confess the truth of what you demand." "If I did show her to you," replied Don Quixote, "what merit would there be in confessing a truth which is clear to all beholders? The importance of my demand is that without seeing her, you must believe it, which if you refuse to do, I challenge you all to battle, ye proud, preposterous crew. And now, come on, one by one, as the order of knighthood requires, or all at once, as is the custom and base usage of those of your breed. Here I await you, confiding in the right I have on my side." "Sir Knight," replied the merchant, "I request you in the name of all the princes here present, that in order that we may not burden our conscience by confessing a thing which we have never beheld nor heard, you will be pleased to show us some portrait of the lady, although if it be no bigger than a grain of wheat, for I do believe that we are already so much on your side, that though her portrait showed her to us a squint of one eye and wearing a hump on her back, we should say all that you wish in her favor." "Infamous rabble!" replied Don Quixote, mightily enraged. "She is neither crook-eyed nor hump-backed, but is straighter than a spindle of Guatemala. Dearly shall you pay for the foul words you have uttered against so immense a beauty as my lady." So saying, he lowered his lance against him who had spoken, with such wrath and fury that if Rocinante had not tripped and fallen in the midst of his career, it would have fared ill with the rash merchant. But alas, Rocinante fell. His master went rolling some distance across the field, and though he struggled to arise, yet was he never able, so encumbered was he by his lance, target, spurs, helmet, and the weight of his old-fashioned armor. And while he strove to rise, he shouted, "Fly not, cowardly brood! Tarry a little, ye base caitiffs! For not by any fault of mine, but of my horse am I thus discomfited." One of the lackeys with the company, hearing these saucy speeches of the poor overthrown knight, could not forbear returning him an answer on his ribs, and coming up to him, he seized his lance, and having broken it into pieces, began with one of them to belabor him, so that in spite of his armor he pounded him like wheat in a mill. His masters called out to him to let the gentleman be, but the lackey was angry and would not give up the game, and running for the other pieces of the broken lance, he shivered them all over the poor fallen knight, who never closed his mouth, but cried out against them for brigands and murderers, for such he took them to be. At last the lackey was tired out, and the merchants followed on their way, talking about the poor belabored knight, who, when he saw himself alone, again made trial to arise. But if he could not do so when sound and well, how could he after being pounded and almost beaten to a jelly? And yet he still considered himself fortunate, for he persuaded himself that this disgrace was one of those things that must of occasion happen to a knight-errant. And though he could not rise on account of being mauled and bruised from head to foot, he put it all down to the carelessness of his steed Rocinante.